thank you for inviting me for this masterclass. I'm really interested to talk on this topic of productivity, which is sort of my daily life at the moment. But the interesting thing in the Productivity Institute here in the UK is that we really look at productivity from many different perspectives, including the economy, including regional performances, the policy side, but certainly also the business perspective. And because ultimately it's the business sector, and particularly the private business sector, that drives productivity to a large extent. But at the same time, we also find that businesses sometimes struggle with this concept of productivity. It's not necessarily a very easy concept, as you already said, Jean-Marc, to understand. While at the same time in the newspapers, we read all the time that, we have all this massive amount of new technologies and innovations, but somehow productivity remains slow. So it's a really big question for business about what's happening out there. And is it really out there, or is there something happening in our businesses? And I will argue in today's talk that there is actually both. There's definitely something happening out there that is explaining slow productivity growth, but there's also something happening in our business, within our businesses, and something that really we can do about. This work is, and I'm going to share my screen in the meantime. This work is part of a project that we're doing with the conference board on productivity from various functional perspectives. HR is one. We're also developing some work on the perspective from innovation. We're developing some work from the perspective of finance. Because indeed, we do feel that one of the reasons that productivity is sometimes so difficult to get your arms around has to do with the fact that the narrative around productivity within the business is not necessarily the same. It really depends on the perspective, the functional perspective that leaders within the firm actually have. So as a result of that, we've had a couple of conversations, particularly with councils, including HR councils, over the last couple of months, and we've done that. We've done that in collaboration with the human capital team, including Marion, and Marion is joining us this afternoon. And she will sometimes actually chip in with some comments, because she has been involved in a lot of the focus groups and pulled some of the comments that people have been making on these calls together. So it will be very helpful and certainly very enlightening to get some of her views on this as well. What I'm going to do agenda-wise is I'm first going to talk a little bit about the question, what actually is productivity and why does it matter? A very basic question, but as I said, it's not necessarily a very easy concept to grasp. So we may want to talk a little bit about that. Then I'll talk about, is there a productivity problem? It's slowing down. That's what we read in the newspapers. And what is that about? And what does that again have to do with us as businesses? And I will argue that it does have something to do with us as well. And then we go a little bit deeper into what is driving productivity in the firm, and then even one step deeper, what is driving productivity of the people within the firm, which is, of course, where the human capital function, the people function comes in very clearly. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about will people leaders, can they make a difference within their own part of the organization, but also within the boardroom of the organization. And Jean-Marc, as you said, feel free to put in your questions throughout the call. If I see them, I'll pick them up, and otherwise we'll pick them up during the Q&A. We thought we also would do a little bit of polling, just to sort of see how you're thinking about it. And the first poll is actually just a very somewhat personal question to each of you on this call. And that is, what do you associate productivity with yourself? Just when you think about productivity, are you in first instance thinking about the productivity of the economy? Are you thinking about the productivity of the organization? Are you thinking about the performance of the people in your organization? Are you thinking about your own performance? Or are you even thinking about your daily personal performance, which is your personal productivity, right? From when you wake up until you go to bed at night. What sort of is the sort of first thing that you would think about? So I'll give you 1 or 2 seconds. Right. So good. So I think what we're seeing is that, it's a bit mixed, and we're not a very large group this morning or this afternoon. So, no statistical significance here, but slightly, people definitely sort of thinking about either your organization or the people in your organization. And I do think that is good news, because those are exactly the things that I think we're mainly going to focus on in this call. Marion, I know that you and I talked a little bit about this as well. I'm not sure if you want to make a comment here right away, because I do know that you've been caring about this first question as well.
Yeah, Bart, I think just to echo your comments, that we found that the leaders in our focus groups thought very differently about productivity. And I think that's what struck us, that there was a very big variety and not necessarily alignment between thinking about productivity at the macro level, thinking about it in terms of the business as a whole and themselves as leaders. But one thing that I did pick up on, which I thought was interesting, was leaders saying more and more that productivity is a part of the leadership role. And I thought that was quite significant insight to hear.
Exactly. And that's certainly something that we will pick up somewhat further down this presentation. So let's start with sort of some fundamental questions. What is productivity? What does it mean? And why does it really matter? And let me start with what many people think it is, and not that's understandable, but what I don't think it should be, and what we need to really think about differently to change the narrative. So a lot of people will at first instant think about productivity about something that has to do with the VUCA world we're living in. This is the world where we have to do more with less. This is the world where we're talking about budget cuts and efficiency drives. It's the issue about more sweat. We have to work harder, which actually is quite interesting, because we say work harder. If you think about productivity as some measure of output over measure of input, if you just put in more hours, that your productivity goes down. But sometimes people think productivity goes up because you work harder. Some people just say it's the end of my job. Productivity means technological change, and that means that the machines are going to take over, or the digital is going to take over. It could be the end of the environment, and all the risk that is creating. So those are sort of negative connotations that are very real, and that I think, again, we got very much on the focus groups that we did, that are very real within companies as well. And it's important that we really try to think about that kind of narrative. So what is it then? How should we actually be talking about productivity? So before I sort of take the sort of positive narrative, let's think about the different concepts, because here already we have a bit of an issue. If you read the newspapers or the Economist, I'm an economist, they really talk about something like the GDP of the economy, or the value added in particular sectors as an aggregate concept of the products and the value of the products and the services that we produce, over some measure of working hours, or some combination of working hours and machine hours, and sometimes it adds other kind of resources to it. But it's a very aggregate type of measure of GDP over these kind of input measures. But there are other measures as well. On the business side, for example, you would zoom in much more on sort of efficiency type measures. So at a company-wide level, you may think about sales revenue or sales revenue per person employed. If you go to particular product lines, you could even talk about output per machine hour or things like that. So they're very sort of clear type of efficiency measures, more technical, quite often, quite useful for understanding parts of the organization, how they are doing on efficiency performance. You can also go to a place-based concept. So you really think now not so much about abstract concept like the economy, but you think about a particular place where people are living, where people create living standards, and they need roads and healthcare and education and all those kind of things in order to lead a better life. That is all productivity. And all these measures have one thing in common. There's some kind of measure of outcomes that you want to realize, and there's a measure of resources that you need to create this. So the way that at the Productivity Institute we like to talk about productivity broadly is to say it's sort of a way to optimally use your resources, combine your resources in order to get better outcomes for people, for firms, and for the economy. That's a broad concept. It fits all these other concepts that you see in the left-hand side of the slide, but it is useful to keep that sort of broader concept in mind, because these things are not independent. What the economy does, what business does, and what happens at a place-based, regional, local level, they're all very connected. So productivity is about how we optimally use resources to create better outcomes for people, for firms, and for the economy. Now, if you keep that sort of broad definition in mind, then you suddenly begin to see the positive connotation to productivity. Productivity is the only sustained source of long-term economic growth, right? We cannot continue to add more people forever. I mean, there's definitely some scope to increase activity rates in the economy, to bring unemployment down even further, but there's only so much we can add in terms of more people. Yes, there's technology, but it's expensive, it's difficult. You need a lot of other things in the organization to make technology work. You can't continue to invest. You need the resources and the financial resources to do it. In the long term, it's only optimally combining these various things that will give you the additional bonus. And that's something that you can continue to do in the longer term, particularly if you're an innovating entity, if you're an innovating organization or you're an innovating place. Productivity frees up resources. If you do productivity, you get more money that you can either give back to your shareholders, to your stakeholders, you can raise wages, but you can also reinvest it in your organization to create more technology and more innovation opportunities. We know that productive companies grow faster. We know they tend to create more employment, which sometimes people don't think is the case, but if you look at the data in the longer term, certainly in the longer term, productive companies produce more employment. Productive jobs get higher wages, not always, but they should, and most of the time they do, and they make people more innovative. Productive people are often, and I emphasize the word often, are often healthier and experience a better quality of life. That has a lot to do with how you think about productivity within the organization. Obviously, if there's more sweat and if there's more burning out people, it isn't. But if you think about the positive side of productivity, it does. And then productive places create better outcomes for citizens, for businesses, and for the economy as a whole, which you can also see on the right-hand side of this chart. So the big narrative around productivity is absolutely a positive one. It's actually critical. If we don't have productivity growth, a lot of things that we want to do within our organizations, but also within the economy as a whole, will not be possible to be done. And that's why this is such a critical topic. So, do we have a problem? And the answer to that is yes, we do. And this chart is sort of probably outlining this at a very high level. Again, this is sort of an economist, macroeconomic viewpoint. This is just looking at the total GDP per hour work, is the level of GDP in US dollars for different countries. And you can see how it's going up, and it has been going up until the last couple of years, but it has slowed down quite a bit. So between 1990 and 2010, we roughly added about $30 per hour to each worker in the economy. Each worker in the economy produced about $30. Some countries were a little lower, some were a little higher, some were somewhat slower, some were somewhat faster, but you can see everybody did. Since 2000, then mid-2000s, just before the financial crisis, but certainly after the financial crisis, we only added another about $5 to $8 an hour to the economy. And this has been happening pretty much everywhere. Yes, there are countries that are higher, France, Germany, the US, they all produce more per hour. The UK produce less, it only produces slightly more than Spain or Italy, but everybody has been slowing. The gap has been opening up between some of those. That's why in the UK, for example, we are worried that the gap has opened up relative to France, Germany, and the US. But this slowing down has been happening everywhere. There is a massive amount of discussion what this is caused by, and this masterclass is not about what the reasons are for all this, but I can't avoid to add at least one slide on it that sort of tries to summarize how complex this issue is and why so many researchers are spending so much time to understand sort of what is the sort of root cause, if you like, of the slowdown in productivity growth. Now, one argument is just saying we're not measuring this well. We're increasingly even in an economy that is increasingly intangible. It's more and more stuff that we can't touch and feel. It's services. It is more digital kind of technologies. And it's very difficult to measure this because we can't just count bricks or count the number of machines that we're producing. We're now trying to get a measure of public services, of business services that we're producing. They have an output, they have a price, they have quality change. So it's an extremely complex topic, and national statisticians and economists struggle with this to do this. Measurement does matter. Measurement is probably one of the reasons that we're probably not fully catching the productivity growth that the economy is facing, but there is quite a bit of consensus among economists and statisticians that this is not a root cause. There's always measurement problems in the economy. We always are, it takes time to catch up to get the right measures. It's not the main factor that we should look at. We can't explain it away by measurement problems. So we have to look at other sources of the slowdown. One could be that we are facing big shocks in the economy, as economists again call it, supply side shocks, the global financial crisis, the pandemic, supply chain disruptions, stagflation that we have been seeing, political uncertainty that we're even still facing today. All these things create uncertainty that make it harder for businesses to take decisions, for politicians to allocate resources, to make investments. And that is obviously a factor that plays a role. If you have many shocks in the economy, it doesn't help productivity. Do we have many more shocks now than we had 20, 30 years ago? Maybe. Also, some people would think that is a debatable question. You always think that you are in the most difficult time in history when you live the moment, but we have had lots of difficult times before as well. There could also be sort of longer term supply side issues. For example, the global economy is just not growing as rapidly anymore. Large economies like China is now becoming richer and richer. And if you become richer and richer, you just start to grow a bit more slowly. So we don't get the same kind of growth from many emerging economies. We are facing an economy or a world that actually is certainly the advanced economies that is showing aging. And therefore, it becomes harder and harder to find the right labor with the right skills in the right place and at the right time. So labor shortages and demographics are one of those long-term sources. There could be issues on the demand side. As our economies get richer, we just are going to produce other products and services. We produce particularly more services these days in advanced economies, less goods. Manufacturing industry just tends to be more productive because they use machines and technology, whereas services, it's quite often more a people-to-people thing. Innovation and technology can help in services, but it just is not driving productivity as fast. And again, if we're in an aging society and we're using more and more healthcare services and other personal services where productivity is even slower, you can just see that it's just a matter of life. It's a fact of life. If you get richer, you're going to use products and services that are just not as productive. So some people say we just have to live with this. It's the price you pay for advancing the world. Now, not everyone agrees with that because lots of people would say, including myself, say there's still a lot of opportunity to grow productivity, but maybe it's just not as fast as it used to be in the past. There could be policies that are wrong. So some people say regulations are wrong. Certainly in the light of environmental changes and climate control and everything, we have to put in a lot more regulations. It's holding businesses back. Some people say we're just taxing businesses too much. Corporation tax is too high and it doesn't help to make investments. Some people say we just don't have enough competition in the economy. And there's actually some truth to that, as I will show in a minute, that perhaps we do have more and more companies that are not as challenged by competition as used to be in the case in the past, and we have globalization headwinds. So all these things could play a role, again, much debated by economists and policymakers and so on and so forth, but there's probably some truth in all of those factors. The big transformational challenges, the climate crisis, inequality, aging again, which I mentioned earlier. But the one that I really sort of wanted to emphasize is really this last one, because this last one is the one where I think we actually, as businesses, do have some control over. A lot of these other things are things that are happening to us. We need to manage them. We need to absorb them. But here we have an issue that we can do something about. And that is that we do have all this technology, but somehow the absorption of the technology, the adoption of these technologies to produce more productive services is slowing compared to what it used to be. And this is strange because in a way, technology is so easy to diffuse these days. But absorbing and integrating the technology in an organization seems to be much harder. Now, there may be a couple of reasons for that that are causing that. And again, there's a big debate in the literature. One is that a lot of today's technologies, particularly digital technologies, tend to take winner-takes-all effects, which basically means is that those 1 or 2 or 3 companies that are best in these kind of technologies capture the entire market. That creates so-called network effects, that create very large ecosystems that they completely control, but it makes it very hard for the others to actually benefit more easily from those innovations that are being made. So we have the winner-take-all or superstar firms, but it makes the diffusion to the ones that actually try to catch up more difficult, and they struggle more to actually pick up these new technologies. Technologies are complicated. We'll talk a little bit, I'm sure, about things like AI and so on. It sounds great, but actually integrating them into a business organization requires a lot of incremental innovations that have to come out of such a big technology. And they just take a lot of time and they need a lot of resources to make this happen. And then finally, there is something like a time lag between the arrival of a technology and the implementation of the technology, because you need to make all these additional investments. You need to invest in people's skills. You need to invest in organizational changes, the way that your organization is operating. You need to think about new markets and the way that you bring these products and services to markets. So we sometimes call this the productivity paradox. There's so much new technology and innovation around, and at the same time, we're not as good in terms of translating it very quickly into productivity gains. Now, the productivity paradox is not new. We've seen this before. This is a somewhat complex, big chart, not need to spend too much time on it, but it's basically the productivity growth rate in the United States. And you can see it's been going up and down. This goes back to the 1950s. So, we had a big sort of uptick in productivity after the Second World War. Then it gradually slowed down in the 1970s and 80s. We had the energy crisis and all these kind of issues. But then in the 1990s, we suddenly got this first phase of digital technology. Those of you who are in the same boat as I in terms of still remembering those times. This was the time of the arrival of the personal computer, the rise of the internet, all great technologies, but it took a while before we really saw the productivity effects coming from it. In fact, there was an economist, Robert Solow, Nobel Prize winner, just passed away a couple of months ago, who once quipped, you can see computers everywhere, but except in the productivity statistics. And that was certainly true for some time, partly to do with the measurement problems I talked about before, but it also had to do that it took time, years, for companies to really fully, it's hard to imagine now, to really fully use these kind of new technologies in digital in order to get the productivity effects from it. Then we had a big uptick in the late 90s and early 2000s. Think of, the huge revolutions in the retail sector, for example, that benefited from that first wave of technology. So we got a big tech boom. And then in the last couple of years, again, we see this coming down. And as I said, there are multiple reasons, but one of them is that this new technology that's coming around, this new wave of digital technology, the move to mobile, the nature of the technology going from replacing routine tasks to replacing more cognitive tasks, really again has us to rethink what this means for the way that our companies are going to operate. So the productivity paradox is not new, it's there again these days, but we do see something that gives us a reason to believe we have a somewhat bigger problem. This chart is probably the most complicated in the complete masterclass, so I have to stay a little bit with it because I do think it is critical that we understand what is going on here. Just think about businesses as being high productivity level or low productivity level. So take all the firms in an economy, these are actually multiple economies, and take the highest productivity ones and the lowest productivity ones, and take the 10% highest productivity. They're at the top of this chart. They're at the frontier. They're the companies that are the most productive companies in a particular economy. Now, everything else has lower productivity levels for multiple reasons. Now, take the sort of little squares there, whatever you call it, in the middle. Those are the medium performance. Those are the companies that are sort of at the 40 to 60% productivity range, or 40, 60% sort of in that productivity distribution. If you look at their productivity performance, it is around 1/3 to 1/2 of the leaders, right? So the 10% has productivity levels that are about twice or 3 times as high as those that are in the median part, the 40 to 60% of the distribution of firms. The difference between countries is about half in the case of France and Germany, Germany and Japan, I think it is. Sorry, I just can't see the bottom part. And then on the left-hand side are ones where it is slightly bigger. And then, of course, it's the 10% least productive firms that, of course, quite a bit lower and a little bit more varied as well. So these are very large differences. Now you could say, okay, that's something of all time, so why should we worry about the productivity slowdown? Well, because the difference between the top performance and the rest has become much bigger over time. So since the mid-1990s, since the start of the first phase of the digital revolution, we have seen the top 5% of most productive companies way outperform the rest of the economy. And that has been going on until around sort of the early 2010s. And since then, also, the top companies actually didn't grow as fast anymore as they used to in terms of productivity growth, but the gap remained very, very large. And this is something that is fairly unique. We haven't seen this as much in the past. It really goes back to this issue of superstar firms, of firms that this winner-take-all effects. And these firms are, from one perspective, great because they are the most productive and innovative firms in the economy. But at the same time, they seem to leave everyone else behind. And that is a big problem because we're looking at a lot of companies that are not necessarily unproductive, right? Just think about, this is one other way to look at it, and then I'll move on. This is looking at the same sort of distribution, but now we're looking at productivity growth. Just focus on the top line for the moment. And what it looks like, this is just for the UK, but we can do this for other countries. If you look at the overall productivity growth between 1998 and 2019, for the UK, that was about 0.9%. That was sort of labor productivity growth. Now, about 2/3 of that, about 60% of that was just taken by those 10% most productive companies, right? That's the blue part of this line. The 50% least productive companies, well, they're less productive companies, so they obviously don't contribute by definition very much, but it's really little, it's only 10%. And then there's a sort of 6 to 9 decile, the 50 to 90% most productive companies that are sort of in the middle of this. But then look at what happened if you break the period up in the first digital part, 1996 to 2007, and the second digital part, 2010 to 2019. I left the financial crisis out just to make clear the point a little bit clearer. What you see is that those most productive companies, they keep contributing enormously amount to productivity growth, right? They account for the same amount of productivity growth as they did in the earlier period. The smaller companies, the less productive companies, the below the 50%, doesn't really change, still about 50%. It's the middle group where we see the slowdown. In the case of the UK, all the companies in the 50 to 90% of the distribution of productivity are accounting for the slowdown. And so those are not bad companies. Those are companies that are they're at the good end of the productivity distribution, but they are showing the slowdown. So the ones that are catching up with those top 10% that have struggled most in order to move things forward. And that is a real problem for the economy. This is for the UK. We do see that in many other countries as well. The numbers may, of course, vary a little bit, but we do think this is a critical part of the story to think about when you think about productivity performance and productivity growth. Okay, so here we are. We now know what is productivity. We know why it matters. We know why it's slowed down. And we know that at least part of the problem of the slowdown is sitting within our businesses. Somehow we're not successful in a large chunk of our businesses to actually really fully use that technology. Now, you may feel your company, maybe we're in the 10%, so we're fine. Well, you could think that maybe you are fine as a company. However, if you're doing business with your suppliers, with your customers, and many of them are actually in that sort of second tier, and they're not doing fine, you will have a problem down the road because the whole economy is going to struggle with that going forward. So the whole distribution matters, even if you're in this kind of top 10%.
Bart?
Yeah.
Before you move on, there are two questions on the in the chat.
Yeah.
One is related, is from Jan. Is there a theoretical maximum in productivity? Could that be a reason that there is a slowdown reaching the peak? Another one on regulation. Does regulation compliance have a significant impact on productivity?
Is there a theoretical maximum in productivity? Theoretically not, but I did make the point earlier that as economies get richer, we tend to change our consumption behavior from products that were typically produced very productively to services that are produced less productively. So there is a shift effect as an economy gets richer, it just starts to grow more slowly. The reason why I'm saying it is not technically limiting us is just look at current AI, or look even somewhat further back, even if you look at sort of big data analysis and so on. Lots of services companies were actually really making very good use of this. So we have seen lots of productivity improvement in financial services and in business services. So it can be done. The big challenge is probably in many of the public services. We would like to use more of these technologies in healthcare, for example, and we do, of course. We see some great achievements in healthcare, but some of these public services are sort of surrounded by lots of issues around government intervention, aging society. So the nature of the demand on these services is increasing enormous. We can do great things at the top end of the healthcare service, but if we don't do something good at the social care area, where we care for elderly people, for example, then at the end of the day, all these people end up in the hospital, and all the gains in the healthcare on the one end are going to be compensated or offset by losses of productivity elsewhere. So lots of opportunity. There's no technical limit, but it is true that some of the slowing down has to do with the fact that many countries are getting more advanced. Does regulation and compliance have a significant effect on productivity? Now, this is a great question. Lots of debate in literature, as you say, between brackets, as free market libertarians argue. Yes, they would say it does. The literature the analysis, the surveys, all the research we're doing shows that this is a very mixed story. The best way to summarize it, and this is true for taxes as well, is that there's a bit of a U-curve, which means that, yes, at some point, regulation and taxation can help to make investments in the economy. It can help to allocate resources where they should be, so you get positive productivity effects. But if you push it too far, it goes the other way around, right? So you get always these U-curves. Where's the sweet spot in terms of the optimal regulation? Where's the sweet spot in terms of optimal taxation? We need companies and people to pay taxes in order to make public investments, as I just said. But if we overtax them, then it will actually offset the effect. So the evidence is mixed on this. And the difficult thing for political scientists and policymakers is to figure out where that sweet spot is going to be. Great questions. Thank you. Okay, let's move on. Business productivity. So let's go to the heart of the matter. Or actually, the heart of the matter is people productivity. But let's first talk a little bit about business productivity. Let's do another poll question. And that poll question is, when you think about productivity of the firm, right? Not individuals, but the firm, what is the main cause of productivity leadership in the most in the most successful firms? In the most successful, what do you think matters most? And I think you can choose more than one. You can try. If not, then just pick the one that's most important. Of course, you will feel there are more that matter, but we'll just like to see where people sort of feel is in terms of what is the one or two or three if you can make more choices. Here's a single choice, so probably you can only choose one. To see where people's minds mostly are. Now, again, we may not have an entirely representative group of business leaders. That doesn't matter. Leadership and management comes up high, is what I would have expected and hoped for. But interestingly, innovation culture and technology is also high. Interestingly, nobody picked workforce skills. That's interesting. Marion, anything to say here? And then on brand and marketing, financial research, I'll come back to that in a second, but they're not being picked. Marion, any comments here? Are you struck by the workforce skills were not picked at all?
I'm a bit struck, but yes, and I think that's not what we're kind of hearing from our companies. Certainly from my perspective, we're hearing a great deal of concern about workforce skills and the need to not just reskill, upskill, but increase people's set of skills so they can be more flexible, they can move around the company more. I think the invest in new technologies, not a surprise, and we saw that very, very clearly in our C-suite outlook for this year, that CEOs are very concerned about investing in new technology, particularly AI. They've got big hopes for AI in terms of the effect on productivity. And I think as well, things like brand marketing and sales really featured very highly in this year, and their concerns about finance in terms of borrowing costs.
Yeah.
So, so I think some elements of this poll reflect what CEOs are thinking, but the workforce skills is a bit of a surprise to me.
Yeah, and of course you have to pick the most important one. So many of you may have picked workforce skills as the second, because obviously I think no human capital leader, and I see Jim nodding, if you had a second choice, you would probably pick, or third, you would probably take workforce skills as well. So, okay, well, actually, again, really interesting research being done in this space. OECD does a lot of great work. They have a lot of micro firm level data that I can work with, and they've done this across a range of countries. So if you take, again, this distribution that I was talking about earlier, you take the top performers and you look at the productivity differences with the median performers, the 40 to 60% companies in the middle, and then try to see, through economic analysis, where are the explanations. It turns out that the human side does actually matter. It matters for about 1/3 of the gap. It actually matters for more than capital. Right, so we talk a lot about the need for investment and everything else. Of course, investment matters, but actually the human capital side matters more. What matters most is the part that isn't defined, and that's all the sort of little stuff. Innovation culture, the competition power of our economy, all those kind of other things that do also matter. But whatever we do, the human side, and you can see on the right-hand side the way this was measured. I look at skill structure, but also looking at demographic composition of the workforce. They're looking at some organizational firm measures like manager share and task diversity and so on. So it's always messy to do this type of work, but the people at the OECD, and I know the people doing this work, do this quite seriously. And I think this is a good indication that the people side really matters, even for understanding the difference between the top performers and the ones in the median. Those are not small, medium-sized companies. These medium performers, they're all fairly large companies, above the average in terms of their productivity performance, but I could make a lot of progress by thinking about the human side of this. Okay, I'm now going to play a little video, and Derek and I experimented with this. This is a video that was done by the Productivity Institute a couple of months ago, years ago. It's actually coming up great. And I just showed this to you. I think it's about 2.5 minutes, but it will save us a lot of time if we go through this, because it allows us to go faster through, and also you can hear another voice than mine. So it's a good break as well, just to look at this video. So I'm going to play it for you right now, and I hope you will enjoy it.
The most successful and profitable businesses are the most productive. Productivity is a measure of how efficiently a business uses its resources to produce goods or services. Businesses that are more productive are able to produce more output with the same amount of input, which can lead to higher profits and faster growth. But it's not just about the bottom line. These businesses are successful and productive because they have typically innovated, invested in new technology, implemented efficient processes, created a culture of continuous improvement, and have invested in their people and intangibles like brand and data. So, what is the secret of these businesses? They think and act strategically and longer term. This makes them more resilient and helps keep them focused on opportunities to build their business. These successful, productive businesses are focused on the bigger picture, company processes, and alignment across functions such as finance, technology and digital, marketing and communication, human resources, and operations. They are also better managed. They monitor operations by using key performance indicators and targets, and ensure that their workforce is trained not only in technical skills, but hard skills, soft skills, and managerial skills too. Productive, successful firms are also ones that continuously manage and track activities which are known to be key drivers of productivity. These 5 key drivers are access to finance and the value of intangible assets, innovation and the implementation and adoption of digital products, investing in worker skills and well-being, inclusive leadership and management training, marketing and communication. Many companies are already gathering information on productivity-related indicators, like sales revenue, throughput per machine hour, number of minutes per customer call, or return on capital, but only in isolation. Good management of productivity is about bringing together boardroom functions to align the different drivers and metrics of productivity and joining them up strategically to improve an organization's performance. To find out more, read Strategic Productivity for the Leadership Team from the Productivity Institute.
Okay, and just to say that study of the productivity, strategic productivity for the leadership team is available on the productivity website, but this is my moment to chip in and make some advertisement for a piece that Marion and I are working on, and that will see the light of day in the next few weeks, where we're actually bringing together the insights from the focus groups, and perhaps also some of your comments that you're going to give us, because we're still working on this piece. So keep an eye on that. That one is coming out as well. So the key takeaways from that video, and the rest of the talk, I will try to drive some of these points home. No single silver bullet, nowhere in the organization. Data-driven and evidence-based, and critically joining up. You can do all these things in isolation, but if you don't join them up, you're not going to get there, right? So no silver bullet, multiple things you have to do, data-driven and evidence-based, and the need to join them up. Those are the key factors that are coming out of that video. So just to quickly drive a few points home, I want to make sure we leave enough for this game, because this is kind of repeating a little bit what was said in this video. But again, these key drivers of business productivity, innovation and digital. So we're not in an R&D world anymore. R&D matters for a very limited number of organizations in the pharma, some in IT, some in electronics. But it's really much broader than that around the whole transformation, the digital transformation of organizations, and the critical role for the diffusion of that knowledge within the company, but also from the leading companies to the following companies. Access to finance, which is not just about how much money is there to make an investment, it is about strategic managing the investment portfolio of an organization, and strategically also managing the cost of that in a much more dynamic way. When we talk to finance leaders around this, they quite often feel they get criticized for being the ones that are controlling the purse. They do. But they also quite often say, if we get involved early on in projects, we can much better understand what the potential is. We have a way to steer the financing of these projects. So it's the strategic part that matters. And then intangibles, and that comes back in marketing and communication, matter increasingly. This is less and less about machines. This is less and less about buildings. This is about the intangible assets of the organization. Data, innovation property, intellectual property, the value of strategic management, the skills of your workforce, and so on and so forth. And on the right-hand side are then the two people factors, which we're going to dive a little bit more into. Skills and training, they do matter. We'll come back to that in a second, but also engagement, well-being, agility, adaptability. I'm going through that very quickly because we're going to talk a little bit more detail about it later. And the same is true for leadership and management. Key here is people critically matter. Remember, about 1/3 of that gap is the people factor, but it can stand on its own. It has to be combined with these other key sources of productivity growth. And that's the challenge that we're facing in many companies. How do we get that productivity out of our functional part of the organization into the boardroom, where we can begin to join those up, even if our perspectives on it are slightly different depending which function we are representing. That's the critical part here. Let's go to our fourth point, the people part. So those two specific parts. And again, I think we're going to first do a couple of quick observations from the focus groups, because they're sometimes really useful to see what some of your colleagues have been saying. So very quickly here, we don't have a clear productivity narrative at the moment. So here's somebody who said, it's just, quite often just seen as another way just to squeeze more juice out of the lemon. This is sort of the first slide that I had early on. Still very, very much a thinking that is around in the organization. Sometimes as a leader, you don't hear this all the time, but believe me, it's there. We don't have a consistent usage and definition of productivity yet. It's interchangeably used with performance or impact, so we don't have a clear data definition around it. Measurement matters. I don't think we have enough understanding about the people side of productivity to make an impact ourselves or to influence other leaders. If we don't understand it, how can we ever influence other people? I'm struggling to define what productivity means to my organization, because it's not something that we've talked about very much internally or with other leaders. And a big barrier in AI implementation, so this is a specific application, is the people's ability to imagine the work differently and to integrate technology effectively and in an innovative way. So again, we do have the technology, but if our people do not understand how they're actually going to use it, what the potential for it is, how we're ever going to use it. Marian, any comments you want to make at this point before I move on?
I think, Bart, just that we were really struck in our focus group conversations with how diverse people's thinking were about productivity, and this really emphasizing that there wasn't a consistent and shared narrative, even within the people function. And so there was something about some sense of, we know it's really important, but it's very implicit. It's hinted at. We have sort of proxy phrases for it. And then we also saw at the other end of the spectrum a very operational based definition, for want of a better word, talking about efficiencies and streamlining processes and cost reduction. And then there was definitely a sense of something around the culture of the organization, that productivity is definitely entwined with cultural values and enablers like inclusion, which is really important, curiosity, learning. So yeah, I think that definitely the lack of a consistent narrative is a big stumbling block to having the type of dialogue and discussions that's needed.
And this certainly is not only true for the human capital function. You see it in the other functions as well, that there is this continuous tension between what can we measure and what do we want to measure. It's a typical lamppost example. So we use for the easy stuff that we can measure and then say, but that's actually not what we're doing. So how are we going to look at the stuff that's outside where the lamp is actually shining on the ground? And that's the hard bit. And sometimes you use qualitative data. Sometimes you just use your imagination. Sometimes you just use some empathy to understand that there is stuff out there outside of the lamppost that you need to take into account. And sometimes that can get you to develop even an understanding of what what's going on outside the data area that can give you the sort of qualitative evidence that you need to drive things forward. So I'm an economist, I love numbers, I'd like to do numbers, but at the same time, in the real world, we have to accept that numbers sometimes also can get us too narrowly zoomed in. So we need to do it, we need to build more evidence, but there's different ways to think about evidence going forward. Okay, this is another quick poll question. This is now people productivity, right? So we talked about business productivity. Now we're talking about the two elements of people productivity. And within that, let's again pick on the one that you care about most. Worker skills and training, engagement and well-being, diversity of the workforce, agility and adaptability, flexibility of the workforce, inclusive leadership, or just the evidence-based, evidence-driven management of outcomes, what I was just talking about in a minute. Again, many matter. Which is the one that you think, you would emphasize first? This is a multiple choice, I see. So you might be able to choose more. I'm not sure. Can't do it myself, so you just have to see what works. Okay, majority of you, agility, adaptability, and flexibility. Okay, work skills coming up. Great. Also evidence-based management, which we just talked about in a minute, but I'd like to come back to the agility and adaptability and flexibility because it's great, but it is exactly the one where, we have to manage the VUCA world that we were talking about a little bit before. So let's dive a little bit more deeply into those as well. And then I want to go to my last section. Marianne, any comments here on the outcome of the poll before I move on?
I just think agility and it's good to see that, Bart, and you and I have talked about agility and adaptability and where does this come. So it's interesting that the group today have really picked that up.
And we'll talk a little bit more about it. Okay, skills. Skills obviously is the bread and butter. Training of people leaders. So all of you would accept that. But there are developments that are important. We tend to talk a lot about high skills. A lot of the research tend to show that the complementarity with medium skill level really matters. So we like to think about, if we talk about technology, we like the data scientists and the smartest people, but ultimately it are the engineers in a production company, the salespeople in a service company that actually drive a lot of the innovation that is happening in the organization. So that complementarity between high and medium skills, don't get overly focused on that small group of incredibly smart, high-paid people who you probably do need at some point, and forget about a large group of people with medium type of skills that matter. Increasingly, and I don't think I have to convince a people audience, an HR audience of this, the mix between cognitive and social, cognitive and emotional skills really matter. Even in today's world of AI technology, the collaboration, the cooperation, the understanding of what this means for people's jobs and tasks matters enormously. And the evidence is just overwhelming that sort of combination of cognitive and social and emotional skills really matters a lot. And finally, upskilling and reskilling, this tendency to continuously go for thinking that the green grass is at the other end, that by recruiting people, you get what you need, rather than working on the people within your organization is a tendency we all have, because it's so hard to work on the people within our organization that we think probably we'll get it from somewhere else. Well, external hires are paid about 20% more than reskilled workers. We know that. And there's also evidence, again, from OECD work that shows that effective reskilling can bring up productivity by 6 to 12%. So in a world of labor shortages, upskilling and reskilling really matter a heck of a lot. And there's a lot of evidence pointing in that direction. Management, many of you already picked that in a couple of times as being critical. It is absolutely true. It's true that again, OECD numbers, a typical firm closes its productivity gap with the frontier by 16% by adjusting its managerial workforce. But if it also works on the workforce skills, so if the managers then do the right thing on the workforce skills, they close it by 35%, right? So you double your impact as a manager if you do a good management job, but you use that in order to work on the skills of your workforce. So that's a very important element. Line management really matters, and it matters particularly on the emotional side. So a lot of the health and well-being, which we'll come back to, is the line managers that are critical because they are the ones that, of course, working with the staff every day, and are the ones that are most easy to observe all these things, all these data that are not under the lamppost, that don't come out of the well-being surveys. but that I do see every day when I work with these people. And it's kind of that evidence where if you have a system where your line managers can feed that into your understanding, makes a heck of a lot of difference. And then, of course, evidence and database driven, which we already spoke about. There's a lot of interesting work around management on how important it is. There's a World Management Survey now. It's great work. It looks at millions of data. That's been a data set developed over time. But it shows that you have a pretty large difference between countries in terms of how countries are doing on management scores. I'll come back in a minute what I exactly measuring. We can't spend too much time on this, but just see that countries like the US, Japan, Germany, Sweden do better than countries like Great Britain or Italy or France. So there are fairly large differences between countries, but even more so, there are huge differences within countries. So what you see, these sort of little distribution diagrams are, again, a productivity distribution, and you can see how firm management practices are distributing across lines. And you can see everywhere that are very well managed firms and not so well very managed firms. You can do a little bit of analysis within those. But so don't get overly excited by the difference between countries, because within countries, these differences are at least as important. What this research also shows is there are some really important differences. Multinational firms tend to be better managed than domestic firms, pretty much true everywhere. So you always see that kind of effect. And we have to think about why that is happening. Some element of diversity, which we'll come back to, that probably plays a role. We know that companies with dispersed shareholders are better managed. Equity firms are better managed. Family-owned but non-family CEOs are better managed. The family-owned but family CEO are just down the list, right? So some things we actually sort of already know, but they sort of come out very clearly. And the last one I wanted to show you is our risk of being over-optimistic of how well we're managing. So what this survey does, it looks at self-assessed management, and it looks at the management score that is being measured on those on the individuals. You see that everywhere, the self-assessed management is better. We think we're better managers than we really are, and that's true everywhere. So again, we have to really think hard about how does management actually work, because it's such an important driver of productivity. Now, the way this is scored, you can see the management domains there at the bottom. Again, we don't have time to go through this. There's a website that we could refer you to. There's a huge amount, massive amount of information, but it looks at operations management, performance management, monitoring, and target setting, leadership, and I can't see the last one, the development matters as well. So those are the sort of management domains that we're looking at. And of course, those are all management domains where human capital leaders will have a role to play. Now, quickly on the other ones, job design. Now, job design, again, bread and butter of what you do in an organization, but it's changing dramatically. Job design used to be writing the right job description. Job design is now continuously reviewing what people are doing. What are the tasks that are undertaken? Which tasks can be taken over by technology? Which tasks can be enhanced by technology? And which new tasks can we think about now that technology is taking away some of the old tasks? So you continuously have to rethink about this. Task management, particularly because of flexible teams, is changing very quickly. And then, of course, there is this huge issue around remote work. Work schedules generally, but certainly remote work that has you to think very differently about how people doing their job, what tasks are they doing when they are remote, what tasks are they doing when they're in the office, how they're working with others in teams, what is being remote, what is being done in person, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of work ongoing at the moment about remote work. I always get the question, what is the impact of this on productivity? The answer is, at a high level, not that much. But we know a few things. We do know that complete remote work, somebody completely out of the office or out of the workplace, is reducing productivity by about 10%, on average, of course. We also know that in the case of hybrid work, it's a very mixed story, because it hugely depends on how organizations respond to the needs of their workers. Are they able to think strategically around it, or are they just sort of letting it go and say, well, people do whatever they want and we'll figure it out and everybody will be happy? And it turns out that's not the case. Nobody will be happy if you don't organize it strategically yourself around it. I think the reason why we don't have the evidence yet is partly because of offsetting effects, but also it's just, I always say, remote work is the biggest labor market experiment in history. we're in the middle of the labor market experiment, only 3 years in. That sounds long, but it isn't. I think only in about 10 years' time, we will really understand where the productivity benefits are going to be. The point is, you can't ignore it. It's there. And just saying everybody back into the office is not going to be the answer, because people have also figured out that this is a different way of working, which most people actually prefer, this kind of hybrid system. So we have to respond to it one way or another. It has huge implications for the way that we're designing jobs. And I think it is a critical matter in productivity and going forward. Worker well-being, multiple aspects to that well-being effect become much bigger since the pandemic. It's partly generational also, but as we all know, we hear this all the time, that particularly that sort of younger generation between 20 and 35 has been seriously hit by the pandemic, but also is sort of reassessing the way that they want to engage with their workplace. I was just listening on an item on Radio 4 on the BBC last night that was basically interviewing HR leaders, where HR leaders said, we just don't have a good understanding of what people in that age group really want, and there are only new workers. We really need to get a better understanding of the way, first of all, what I experienced during the pandemic. It's hard for us to imagine that, and secondly, even if we can imagine it, we have to find a response to this. So this well-being element has become very important. We also know that well-being is not just a matter of doing an annual survey. It is really about putting capabilities in place as an organization that allows people to continue to benefit the offerings that you're giving to them, whether that is in well-being setups, in investing into a better healthcare system within your organization, and so on and so forth. It's a capabilities approach, rather than just figuring an annual survey and trying to make some small steers to it. Diversity across all dimensions. I was just trying to look. We have some numbers here that I think are just showing strikingly how important diversity is. I wanted to mention a specific issue of aging. I've mentioned that before. I really care about aging. Because it's one of those forces we just don't see what a big thing this is. But, it's not only that it's harder to get younger workers, it's just that older workers want to stay for longer because they're healthier, they want to stay in work, particularly if the work is interesting, and we have to respond as organizations to this. And there is still a tendency in organizations to think that older workers are a drag on productivity. And that can be if you do it wrong, but again, numbers from the OECD are showing that a 10% higher share of older workers can make companies 1.1% more productive and can create a 4% lower staff turnover compared to the average firms, provided that the company embarks on strategies that include phased retirement programs, flexible working options, early interventions if people see reduced work mobility, and also experiential and group learning. So you've got to do something as a firm to make it happen, to get that kind of productivity effect. But it is vast, and it is only going to be more important. And it is one of the things that I don't think we quite often see happening. Women in management, again, we do see that particularly at the lower end, there's a low share of women in management. If you go from, say, 5% of women in senior management to 20%, you increase the productivity of your firm by 1.4%. So U-curve, at some point, it doesn't have much effect anymore. But if they are in a huge minority, bringing them to the sort of middle range is just making a massive difference. And then finally, and that was the final point, so it's good that you picked all that one, is agility and resilience. And Marion was right, we discussed that, because originally we had that as something like technology. And then we said, well, yeah, sure, technology is an important part that is creating this kind of turbulence in an organization, but there's a lot more, also the negative shocks that I talked about in the beginning of my presentation, is the disruptive technology. But the question really is, as an organization, how are we going to continuously kind of absorb these kind of impacts of technology? And I put some words there at the end that sound interesting as words, but if you think about how you strategize around agility and resiliency, purposeful means that you have a very clear identity in terms of core values that you have. Awareness is all about scanning and engaging on threats and opportunities. So you continue to have to see what these threats and opportunities are, and you have to engage on them. Action-oriented, that means that you are forward-leaning, that you're kind of open to change, that you're willing to try and experiment. Resourceful means that you're creative and innovative in the way that you're using your resources. The comments that I just made on the capabilities approach and worker well-being is just one of them. and networked, which means that within and between organizations, this sort of communication element really, really matters. So those are some comments around the sort of people-based type of strategies. I get a few thoughts from the focus groups about why the people factor really matters. So here was comment: HR needs to be strong in its conviction that ultimately productivity depends on people. Technology investment matters, but it's people that pull all the pieces together. It's down to HR to articulate the value of investment in skills and management capability. That's going to be the business case, which acts as a catalyst for whether we're making investments in human capital. People function can capitalize on new opportunities by offering real-time people data. So this is the analytics part, the data element, to both measure productivity and connect both human capital and business measures. HR is expanding, shifting leadership, and ensuring behavior is connected to productivity. And culture. Culture and mindset is the #1 big driver, and this explains performance difference across business and regions. And part of the cultural piece is trust. Maybe, Marion, you want to make a comment on that as well, because we've been debating a little bit this issue around trust within the organization, trust between managers to employees and trust of employees into the managers. Marion, any comment on that? Because I know that you've been engaged on this topic very much.
Yeah, I think, Bart, that it just strikes me that under all these main drivers of people, that trust is the sort of oil in the engine, because, you know, if you're going to get people to be open about their skills, if you're going to look after people's well-being, if you're going to create confidence in the future of the company, the decisions that are being made, a lot of it is about inspiring trust in your people, both at the individual manager team level, but also at the organizational level in terms of the leadership team. But actually, Bart, I'm just wondering if we can put Tara Murphy on the spot here, because Tara was also with us when we were talking to very much the operational heads of HR. And Tara, do you want to make any comment here? And I hope you don't mind me putting you on the spot.
You're muted, Tara. Where is the unmute button?
Apologies. Okay, there we are. I think there was a sense, like we spoke with the HR operations leaders, talent acquisition leaders, and some people analytics leaders. One of the things, the phrases I took away from it, or a couple of ideas, was the sense of, because I think all of these thoughts resonate, is the productivity of engagement. So there was a sense in the group that said, actually, we can't always say, you know, it's not possible to measure the HR. So it was, you know, what is the productivity of engagement? Can we express that? I think there was a desire to sort of focus on sort of what members were saying was relevant productivity. So I think the guidance you show there, Bart, is really helpful. And in a way, you might say, you know, how do you prioritize between all those drivers of talent, leadership, performance, etc. And the desire, in a way, we also touched on our discussion about outcome and impact, because there is a sense that, yes, you can measure productivity in terms of, you know, number of people supported per activity, etc. But it would be really nice if we could move the conversation to impact and outcome. And finally, then, I suppose that the importance of the communication and change management and leadership and management, the quality of leadership and management, you know, also came through. So I don't know whether they're sort of just some small add-ons.
No, really helpful. Let's quickly, I'm going to drop this poll question because I really want to wrap up and have some more time for questions. Can human capital leaders make a difference? Right. So, I mean, because ultimately, as I said, joining up means you join it up within your own organization. But the next step is to have the conversation with other leaders in the organization who may have different lenses and other perspectives on this. And I think it is important to take that into account. So this is a way to think a little bit about this. Obviously, we are very focused here on the employee focus, but your colleagues who will focus on the operational productivity focus is absolutely critical to the organization. And then other colleagues, particularly in the marketing and sales department, will be very focused on the customer focus of this, because that's such an important driver, especially in services organization, but not only, to the productivity story. So ultimately, the question is, how do we bring this discussion to the boardroom, where we speak with each other? And how do we bring these different definitions in contact with each other? And how do we join them up into a scoreboard in an analysis that makes productivity part of our strategic thinking? And that is a difficult one. And that's the one where we would love to do more work with companies or hear from you to really think on how you're thinking around this. But again, a few quotes are quite interesting here. people saying HR can help with creating that wider narrative, and it will help HR to get more leverage to influence the business. HR may not be driving key decisions on productivity, but it has responsibility for influencing and equipping leaders for broader thinking and better decision making. HR has a direct responsibility for productivity of people, leaders, and culture, and that's an integral part of the strategy. And that would have to include culture and leadership. What is the company that we want to build? And finally, here's an interesting one I want to close on. So an organization had a new CEO, and a new CEO who really made an impact by starting to talk very early about productivity, but in the context of sustainability and the importance of leaving the business in a better state for the next generation. The idea of leaving a positive legacy resonated with people. It goes back to my earlier comment about the new generation of workers that we're getting into the company, and they're really thinking about these kind of things. So it really brings me back to this chart that I showed you at the beginning on, we have firm productivity and we have to talk about it, but it is part of what people do in a firm. Is part of their lives. It's part of the place where they live. It's part of the economy in which they're living and the way they're engaging with other people. So ultimately, productivity is a way of really getting to something that is inclusive. And inclusive means, from a productivity perspective, one, that people have broad access to all the resources. So it's, whether it's education or health or housing or access to transportation, it's important that we give as many people access to these kind of needs. Secondly, that we then transform, this is productivity, transform them into better outcomes. And finally, make sure that we distribute the gains of those widely, which is exactly what the CEO was saying, that we have to make sure that society as a whole is going to benefit from this. So the link, productivity can really be a good way to think about purpose without sacrificing what you actually have to do as a company, which is become more productive, because that's the only source of long-term business growth. That's why I'm passionate about this topic. That's why I think it is important that we keep focusing on this, because it's a way that we can actually have sort of a win-win for businesses, but also for society as a whole. And that will be a really good way forward.